In the last video, I showed you how you can get a full stack application with Next.js and AWS with the CDK up and running and deployed locally in your environment. That's great. What's even better? Getting that thing live on the web for everybody to see. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I know how every CI/CD pipeline out there is going to work, and this isn't a one-stop solution, but this is going to be an excellent foundation for you to get started on building your next application and not asking your mom to visit it on localhost 3000. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. And without further ado, let's go and get started. All right, now if you want to go ahead and see how I built out that AI application, I'm going to go ahead and leave a link right here for you. And this is going to go ahead and be a sample deploy application. Same as before, we're not going to use the app directory in this example, though I'm thinking about switching over to it, honestly. And we're going to go ahead and use TypeScript and all this good stuff here. Now that we have that set up, let's cd into that sample deploy directory, create a backend, cd into it, and set up our CDK application. Awesome, we got that taken care of. Now let's open this up in VS Code. Now, the focus of today is definitely going to be deploying and hosting. So we're going to go ahead and speed run through some of this stuff. But again, I have videos that you can check out if you want to go ahead and see what those are about. So I'm going to go ahead and get our API directory set up. We're going to call this file appsync.ts. All right, so while we're in here, let's just go ahead and get our construct initialized, and then we can, of course, walk through and see what's going on. Okay, so if you've seen the last video, nothing too crazy going on. We went ahead and are taking huge advantage of the new L3 construct that Amplify gives to us. And then we have an authorization type from the regular AppSync construct library here. In terms of prompts, we just need an app name. And then what's cool is that we can just come down here and say, yeah, this API is only going to have an API key. And then it's going to be valid for 7 days. And we can go ahead and deploy this over to AWS using this schema that we haven't created just yet. Let's go ahead and create that right over to the side. And we'll just call this a schema.graphql. Okay, so in this file, we're only going to have a simple to do, and I do want the database to automatically be created for us. So I'm going to say app model. And then when it comes to the auth rules, we're going to keep this very simple, folks, since we're using a public API key. I'm going to say that the rules here is going to be allow public, and that will default to our API key. So not anything you probably want in production, but what we're going to say is that anyone can go ahead and create, read, update, and delete from our database using these values right here. Cool for our demo purposes, but now that we have this in place, it looks like the next step that we need is actually our hosting construct. So right next to API, I'm going to head over to our lib directory and create a hosting file, and we'll call this amplify.ts. Okay, so with our hosting construct set up, and again, if you want to know more like hosting, I have a full video on how you can host your front-end applications using AWS Amplify using the AWS CDK. The thing about that video is that it doesn't cover bringing in your backend infrastructure. It's just hosting your front end. What we can do here is essentially take a peek at this, and this is where that video left off. We have our hosting props, right? App name, what account we're working with, the branch of the repo, the owner, the repo itself, and then a GitHub token name. And this is going to be a GitHub personal access key that is stored on AWS. Again, check out that video. Down here, we simply set that up, get it all configured. Web compute is specific to Next.js, and this essentially says use server-side rendering enabled for specifically Next.js. If you're not using Next, simply tack off that hyphen or underscore compute, and you can just use web. Automatically delete the branch on Amplify when the branch is deleted from GitHub. Set up some custom rules for rerouting. We have environment variables set up here. And then the core of the show here, and the part that we're going to be taking a look at in just a moment, is this build spec file. All right, Amplify needs this to know how are you going to be building out your application. Easy enough. We are going to run npm CI, so install the dependencies, and then run this build command. Now it's looking at this .next folder because that's what Next spits out at the end of the day. Next up, we're going to go ahead and connect one of our branches to Amplify, specifically whatever branch that we happen to be passing in. For us, it's going to be this main branch that we have set up right here. All right, so with that in place, let's head over to our lib/, and then we can do our backend stack. And just get rid of this boilerplate code and start to peel this away and then set up our API as well as our hosting. Okay, so looking at what we have here, we're just bringing in our GraphQL API, and then we have our hosting part with all the values that we have. It's going to be on my mtleando repo, and then GitHub token is listed there, and then sample deploy, just double checking that. I'm eventually going to call this repo sample deploy. But this has to match not the folder that you're in, but the repo that you have deployed on GitHub. Now, this is all assuming that we have this deployed, but before I actually commit this up, there is one spot that I want to go ahead and tweak, and that's going to be right here at this exclude By default, Next.js is going to try and bundle in that backend directory. It doesn't know that it's a CDK project. So I can say backend to basically say ignore that. Now, when I come into here, I can go ahead and push this all up to GitHub. Let me just make sure that I'm in the Rudera project, not that matters. And then I can say commit. Great. I have this taken care of. It's going to be a public repo called sample deploy. There we go. And oh, it already exists. Good thing I checked that. So let's tweak this real quick and we'll just call it sample deploy YouTube. But before I commit that, now I have to change this name right here, -YouTube. Okay, so now when I click on publish, I can select public repository, sample deploy -YouTube is what we have, and then select public and push this up. Great, I just wanna make sure sample deploy YouTube looks good. And if I slide over, I can go ahead and view this repo. I'm pretty happy in the state of things so far. So what I'm gonna do next is deploy this up to AWS. I go back up to this backend directory, clear this out, and then run my deploy command. Now, when I deploy this, I want you to see what happens here as soon as this gets done deploying. So let's get this set up. All right, we have the roles and everything spit out for us. So we'll let this do its thing and come back as soon as it's done. Okay, it looks like it just got done. Now, here's what's super, super interesting here is that when I get done deploying, the things that my front end needs, specifically this API key right here, in addition to the authentication type and the AppSync region, are all living on my backend. Now it's like, how do I get those populated to my front end? I can just copy and paste them. No need to do that because we can have this automatically generated by running our deploy script. Now this isn't going to do much for us, but when I go ahead and run deploy, I can tack on an outputs file that I want this to output. Now, where should I be putting this file? It makes sense that I put it in my front end. So I'll have it named just like this, and I can actually deploy this one more time. Now, I could have done this from the beginning, but I wanted to show you what the terminal spits out versus what we can do. So this is the command that we're going to need. Let me create some space here. And what I'll do is paste in some CFN outputs so we can get better descriptors. All right, and once I get that pasted in, this is essentially what we have. We have the URL of our AppSync API being spit out for us. And the cool thing is that it's going to be under the prefix whatever our backend stack name is. So I can say it is backend stack and then dot GraphQL, dot AppSync API URL. Next up, we need the API key for our front end. So we can go ahead and pass this in to our front end and then our authorization type, which is just going to be API key. Now I could have just put the literal string API underscore key, but I wanted to show you how we can drop down to various resource levels. In this case, the L1 construct. So that way we can get the actual authentication type dynamically. Now over in our terminal, now we can spit this out into our front end and we can see just what gets created for us. Okay, just get done deploying. Let me get rid of this terminal. And if I look at my code base and move this over a little bit for you so you can see it, once I scroll down, you can see that I do have this outputs.json. Now coming in here, just like I mentioned, we have this backend stack dot, and then all the values that Amplify gave us, or rather the CLI from the CDK gave us based off of that Amplify construct. But in addition, we have the names that we wanted to generate. So even though it's duplicated, we can now be assured that we named it however we wanted it to be. This is great. This is going to live at the root of our directory. So now when I have my AWS exports file, I can bring this in. Or better yet, I don't need an AWS exports file because I just created my own. Now, before we move on to deploying our CDK code, I do want to go ahead and commit this just to make sure that our build is set up correctly. So once I sync these changes and head over to our sample deploy, we should get an automatic deploy happening for us. Okay, great. So you can see commit with exports is taking place. And this is going to do nothing more than build out our front-end application. So far, it knows nothing about our CDK project. All right, so with our application deployed, we can click on these build setting items right here just to verify everything went through successfully. We can actually click on this domain, and what we should be presented with, is our Next.js application listed right here. I know it's small, but this is your typical Next.js app, right? Great, we know that our front end is working just fine, but again, our backend isn't really set up. Now, one of the things that we often want to do is have automatic code generation for us. That's one of the beauties of working with AppSync and Amplify, right? So typically in an Amplify CLI application, that automatically happens when you push up your code using the Amplify CLI. That won't work in our case, so we have to figure out a different way. I'm actually going to move this over and create some room just like that for us, and then clear this out. And then make note of this API key that we have right here from AppSync. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and then clear out my terminal. So while I'm in my directory, I'm actually going to paste in the following piece of code. And the way that we want to do that is say, hey, npx, and then we can call the Amplify CLI just like normal, right? However, instead of having it provide automatic defaults for us, we have to be the ones to set what we want to be doing. So I'm going to say US East 1 here for the region. And then for the API ID, which is going to be another parameter that we're going to pass it in, it is the ID of the AppSync API that we're working with. So I can paste that in just so. Now, I am actually working with an AWS profile. So what I need to do is prefix this with AWS underscore profile and set this equal to my profile that I have currently running, which is Focus Otter Sandbox. Now this is great, but this is just accessing the CLI. So I'm going to hop in here and I want to say I want to code gen and add all of these files. And with that in place, I'm actually going to open back up the file system so we can see just what's happening when I run this command. It should look very similar to applications where you might have ran the AWS CLI before, AWS Amplify CLI. We're going to select React. We want our types, process, and TypeScript. Source directory, yes, create all of the mutations, etc. for us, set the depth to 2, and of course, create the code. Using my profile, it's authorized to download our schema, and sure enough, I have all of the GraphQL queries, mutations, and subscriptions that I need for my application. This is great, but it's in the wrong spot. So I'm actually going to slide this over here, and then I have to think, when in fact do I want these GraphQL files to be created and stored for me? And the answer ends up being after my CDK application deployed, but before my front-end application gets a chance to build. That seems to be the gap. We need our front end to make use of these files, but we need our back end to be deployed so that those files can be created. And now we've reached the part where our CDK application, our amplified construct, needs to have an updated role because it has to make these CDK commands possible, which will eventually call the amplified codegen. So I'm actually going to delete this file. This is really just to demonstrate what was happening here. Let's delete this source directory and we'll delete this GraphQL config and schema.json. That's everything that Amplify creates on our behalf. We can get rid of this and clear out some space here. And let's head back to our hosting stack here. So we have this in place. Now here's the thing. Amplify by default doesn't have the ability to call or to make CDK commands. It only has the ability to build out our application. So we have to update the role that it's expecting. Fortunately, it's not too tough. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in an update here. And with that in place, let's take a look at where we're at currently. So we have our hosting props still there. But what ends up being new is the fact that now we are creating an Amplify role. So it will give us one by default once again. But in this case, we're going to say, no, this one is going to be the name of the repo hyphen Amplify deploy from CDK or whatever you wanted to call it. Now we're going to give it an inline policy and there's two of them. One is going to be the ability to make any CDK command that we want. Here's that role in that policy right here. The second one is we want to give this role the ability to call codegen. And what that ends up doing behind the scenes is calling an introspection API from AppSync. So we're effectively going to say, you can go ahead and call this on AppSync right here. And that's it for our role. We end up passing it as a prop right over here to our Amplify construct. Now, everything else is pretty much the same, except when we get down here to our build spec, because again, this is where we can define what are those build properties that you expect. So when this runs, and keep in mind that this gets ran from the root of our project here, right? We're first going to cd into our backend. And then from there, we'll install our backend dependencies. These are going to be for the CDK. Once those get installed, we're ready to deploy our CDK application. Now, keep in mind that we are going to create that outputs file so that our front end can read this and get the values that it needs. That's going to be super helpful for the Amplify libraries. Next up, we go back to our front end directory. This is going to be the root of our project, our Next.js application. Install those dependencies. And then down here in our build command, we have the ability to build out our Next.js application. But keep in mind, one step that's missing here is going to be the ability to make that codegen call. So I'm going to add this in right here. And now that this is pasted in, you can see how this all starts to come together. Now here's where I like to cheat a little bit. There are going to be two areas that really just make your lives a little bit easier here and make it so you don't have to write as much code. I'm actually going to run that same codegen command right up here in the root of my application. So that is right where I need it to be. I'm going to say JavaScript and give it all the same defaults as before. And the reason why I'm doing this is so that I don't have to enter all of those commands in a headless mode inside of CI, because you saw I was hitting enter there, right? Now that those are there, and I just want to validate that real quick, I'm going to come down here. You can see in the root of my application, we have exactly what we need. I don't have to do codegen add anymore. I can just do codegen, and that will automatically find the right project based off of this API ID. It knows all those defaults, and in case you're wondering how, And that's going to be coming from my .graphql config, which has all these defaults for you. Another common thing that I see people do is just keep this file around and copy it from project to project, updating the source paths for where you want your Amplify project to be. All right, so with that in place, the only other optimization that I would think of is sticking this inside of a deploy script in your package.json. Here is fine, but just keep in mind, if you have it in here, the benefit of doing this is that you can dynamically pass in your region and your API ID and any other props, of course, by tacking those in as right up here, doing something like an API ID, and then setting that to a string and passing it in from our AppSync stack, or rather our backend stack here. That's the wrong one. We're going to say our backend stack right here. So you can pass this in, you can see it's expecting an API ID, and then now you have a dynamic reference to it. And then right down here, you can use the construct to really get into the values that we have here. So there's an API key. It's expecting a string or undefined. We're going to say that this is absolutely going to be there. Note that you can do that. I'm actually going to revert it back to how it was. All right, so a common gotcha is that I want this to be deployed and ready on Amplify hosting to take advantage of. But if I push it up to GitHub right now, it's going to run and it's going to use the old build spec. This hasn't been deployed yet, so it doesn't know what build spec to use. I guess the order of events is that Amplify hosting will use its most current build spec, deploy the application, which will update the build spec, and then it will continue to build out that way. We don't want that. We want the build spec to be updated right now. So I'm going to CD back into our application here, just like that. And then I'm going to deploy this over to AWS. One cool thing in the deploy real quick is that we have the ability to have AppSync introspection schema allowed on our CDK role here, heading over to Amplify, in addition to our Amplify service role having the ability to call any CDK portion of the application. Rather, it's this IAM policy right here that is being affected. I think it's pretty cool. I'm going to scroll and then I'll continue once this is all deployed. All right, quick little sanity check. Now that is deployed, if I head over to my Amplify app, I'm going to bump this up one time for you folks. If we go to sample deploy, that's what we're working with. Notice that the deployment hasn't kicked off, and that's great. That's what I want, because over in the build settings, I need to make sure that it has all the commands that I was expecting. And sure enough, it does have them just right there. So with that in place, I'm going to head back over to my application, commit everything over to GitHub, which is going to say add Amplify deploy with CodeGen. Push that up, and then we should see our new deploy triggered. Awesome. It looks like it has our commit listed right down here at the bottom. So then from here, I can just wait for this deployment to happen. And what I want to make note of is that I'm doing this incrementally. You can, of course, combine some of these steps where I'm testing and then checking things in the console and then testing again. Combine those to suit your level of comfort. But I just want to show you the individual parts as they're happening. And again, the beauty of infrastructure as code is that once this is deployed and in your account, you have this so that you can just tweak some files, set up your GitHub repo, and deploy this and be off to the races. One area that I am curious of is going to be this build section. You can see that it's cloning the repo. There isn't a backend portion. I know that we have a backend like CDK application, but when it says backend, it's talking about like an Amplify CLI backend. So really, all of our stuff is going to be happening in the front end build portion, where we have a pre-build and then we have a proper build. So this backend section is going to say something like, hey, there's no backend environment. Continuing. All right, so here we get to the front end portion. Now, typically this is where I like to go through and speed run past this part, but I think it's important to see at least this first time what's happening. We're in the pre-build phase. We're going to cd inside of our backend directory, install the dependencies. Looks like it did that just fine. And then look what's happening here. It's running CDK deploy, right? And it has our output.json. So it's actually running our CDK commands, which by default, Amplify doesn't have the ability to do. The synthesis time took 5.79 seconds. It should be super fast because we've already built this locally and deployed. Scrolling down a little bit, user initiated, these are going to be all of the deployment steps that we typically see in our CDK applications. Once this gets done, we should be moving on over to the front end portion of our application here, where it's building out our Next.js app. But one area that I am curious of is the CodeGen portion. So let's see what happens as we scroll here. We see some proper publishing steps. We have the updates being completed. Cool. I don't know if you're a nerd like me, I think it's cool. Backend stack is all ready to go. It took about a minute, right? The outputs file was successfully printed out. And then as we continue through here, we're going to change into the root of our project, install our front-end dependencies. And here it is. Here's that CodeGen command right here. I just want to make sure you all can see this. Here's our code gen command right here. It's generating our GraphQL query successfully. And remember, it uses that .graphql config to automate that portion for us. When it gets over to our CDK application, compiled successfully, and we can see our static pages being built out. This is typical Next.js stuff. With that, terminating logging, this is great. Now, that's the power of doing things incrementally, is that you can build up to having a robust pipeline. Had I tried to do this all in one go, who knows what might have happened? Actually, I know, because I did a live stream and it took me 2 hours to get this working. So check out that live stream if you want to see all of my flubs. But yeah, this has been pretty good so far. You can see it's deployed. And if I check this out on the web, we get our front end application. Now, this isn't doing much, right? This is just our regular front end application. What we have to do from now is just verify. Can we get an API call made using the Amplify libraries? And I think that's the final step before we can wrap this up. Now, I'm not going to overcomplicate this part. So what I'm going to do is head over to our underscore app.tsx and then just get our typical Amplify config situated for us. So I think these are the imports that I need, where I'm bringing in AWS Amplify, and I just installed that. And then I'm going to bring in that outputs.json file. Now, keep in mind that this contains all of the values that our application actually needs. And then when I configure Amplify, I need to pass in the config. And this is what Amplify CLI typically creates for us. But if we head over to the Amplify documentation, I'm on the CLI section under GraphQL, and we have two parts here, Amplify CLI and with the CDK. What I can do is say, I've already used the construct. If I scroll down a little bit, there should be this section here where it'll tell me, how do I integrate this inside of my application? So I'm actually going to copy this, come over here, paste it in, and then update the values. All right, and that actually wasn't too tough. We just passed it in the values that we already had. Now, this essentially gives us the ability to call our backend services from our front end. Now, locally, this works. When we're deploying this on AWS Amplify, this works. Let's just do a quick little sanity check in our pages directory. And we're going to say, hey, index.ts.pages, how about we slap in a quick use effect? And then once we paste in this use effect, you can see that we can use the IntelliSense offered by all those API types that were gathered for us. So when we head over to our source directory and we have this API.ts, it has everything that we need in terms of proper TypeScript support. So I'm going to make sure that it's wrapped in a promise. I'm going to get this GraphQL result right here. So I can say todos.then, and then when I get that response, I'm just going to log out the response. And then this is where things get really cool. I can say response.data.list todos. And I believe there are a .items listed right here. Super cool. Let's go ahead and run this locally, push it up, and then see if we can get it running on the web. So again, I know it's not necessary to run so iteratively, but I'm going to say npm run dev to get this set up, and then we can test this out in the console. So localhost 3000 is what we're working with. Hop over here. There's our application. If we inspect this, let's check the console, and sure enough, we can see an array of 0. Always note that in dev mode, use effect runs twice. So that's why we see it twice here. If we head over to our network tab and check out our fetch requests, I'm sure that there's a GraphQL item in here somewhere. There it is. And you can see that we are getting the data. This is going from AppSync to DynamoDB. Now, this is great, but again, let's get this running on the web. So I'm going to say final test right here. Push that up, head over to Amplify. And then now we should be able to see a new deployment being kicked off. And then hopefully when this all gets deployed, this is going to be live on the web for us. Okay, so we got that set up. Looks like it was provisioned, built, and deployed. Let's click on this application just to make sure that we are in fact live. You can see right up top here, very small letters. Maybe if I do Command L, yeah, you can see it a little bit closer that way. But we have our inspect just as showing that we're live on the web. We do get an array. As I mentioned, a use effect only runs twice in dev mode. That's why we have array 0 right here, just the one time. When I go over to my network tab, what do we get? If I can find you and give this a quick refresh, we get GraphQL right here. And then sure enough, we get our to-dos. All right, but with that out of the way, again, I do want to note this was a very iterative approach. Once you have this set up in GitHub, it really is just copying these files over, switching out the GitHub repo name, and clicking deploy. Now, I'll admit, this wasn't set up correctly the very first time. If you want to see how that interaction went, I do have a live stream up where I was engaging with everybody. They were seeing all of my flubs. We had a good time. We did end up get it working. But until then, focus on our family. I'll catch you all next time. Peace.